Good afternoon. Ralph, the Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar examining the impacts of rail trails on home prices and demographics in the neighborhoods near those trails. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to let you know about a couple of other upcoming Joint Center. So next Friday at 1 o'clock, note the news start time, Jenny Schutz, VP of Infrastructure and Housing at Arnold Ventures, will be speaking about the empirical challenges of evaluating the impacts of the many state laws that have been passed in recent years that seek to spur the development of more housing, usually by constraining localities' ability to limit new housing. Should be a terrific event. Jenny, as many of you know, has long been one of the leading scholars about the nature and impact and responses to local land use regulation. And Arnold has taken a particular interest in trying to figure out how we measure the impact of those new state laws. A week after that, on Friday, April 10th, we will be hosting a half-day, all-afternoon event focused on innovative approaches to encouraging intergenerational housing in communities with panels that will feature researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. This will be a hybrid event in person at the Graduate School of Design and online. You can find more information about that on our website. And then 4 days after that, on Tuesday, April 14th at 4 o'clock, the Joint Center, along with Harvard's Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority, will be hosting an event to release a new Joint Center report examining how redevelopment authorities in Massachusetts might support the development of new affordable housing, particularly new social housing. While that is a hybrid event, the in-person capacity, we've reached the in-person capacity, so if you'd like to attend, you'll have to attend online. More information about these and other Joint Center events is on our website. Now on to today's talk. Our speaker today is Michelle Lee. Michelle is a Meyer Doctoral Fellow who successfully defended her dissertation earlier this week. Congratulations. And so Michelle will receive her PhD in public policy, or she'll get the diploma in May at graduation. Michelle will be discussing work she did as a Meyer Fellow, which we published earlier this week as well. It's been a big week for you, Michelle. In a new working paper examining what happens to neighborhoods after nearby abandoned rail lines are turned into rail trails. Michelle will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions for about 15 to 20 minutes. As always, I will moderate. And as always, please use Zoom's Q&A to submit your questions, which I will draw on in moderating. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. We usually have more questions than time to answer them, but we will share them with Michelle, and she may decide to follow up with some of you. We will wrap up right around 1:15 p.m. Video of today's talk, copies of the slides will be posted on our website, which already has Michelle's paper and a blog about it, and we'll post a link to both the paper and the blog during the webinar. Michelle, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. And also thank you to the Joint Center for Housing Studies for sponsoring my work. I'm going to share my screen. All right. If that looks good. So I am delighted to present my paper today of Tracks and Trails, How Accessible Green Spaces Reshape Communities. As a starting point, access to green spaces have long been part of public awareness. Just to give you some examples, to the left here is a writer from the 1800s extolling the virtues of a public park, calling it the lungs of the city. During the pandemic, nature has been a place for people to meet and gather in relative safety. And this past fall, the former governors of Vermont and Wisconsin co-wrote this op-ed talking about how they found common ground on the rail trail. At the same time, Urban environments vary dramatically, and access to green space tends to correlate with socioeconomic status. So this is a graphic showing that within the same city, places that are wealthier tend to be more green, and places that are poorer tend to be more gray. In recognition of this, many jurisdictions are investing in green space development, frequently in formerly industrial areas. These places are valued by residents, but historically scarce in these neighborhoods. We know from the environment and health literature that there's evidence of health and social benefits associated with access to green environments. So for policymakers, they oftentimes use kind of development of green space to fulfill dual policy goals of enhancing climate resilience and supporting community revitalization. So, given the proliferation of these initiatives, I ask the question, what are the impacts of urban greening on housing markets and the communities around them? So, as a roadmap for today, I'm going to describe my research setting. I'm going to talk about the data sets I use. I'll present the two analyses I conduct in my paper, and I will conclude. So, diving into the setting, the challenge for investigating the impacts of urban greening is that it is hard to separate the cause and the effect. You can think about this in the sense that new green space often comes alongside other investments. For instance, you improve a public school, you improve the nearby park, you ground a highway, as we see in the Big Dig in Boston. You build a greenway on top of it, or in general, with like oftentimes with the redevelopment today, you see kind of more green spaces for the public that get built. So, in trying to disentangle all just the pure effect of green from all these other effects, I'm going to study a very particular setting, which is rail trails, which are by definition linear parks built on abandoned rail. If you've never heard of a rail trail before, I have here one of the most famous examples, which is the New York High Line. First, in the year 2000, when it just was abandoned rail, and then in the year 2013, when it's been converted to this now park. And what I like about these two photos is that you can see that they're taken virtually at the same place. And you see that on the right, it's become quite literally more vibrant and more accessed. And also, you see this shiny new development that's built in the background, which provides some descriptive evidence that there's economic development going on near these rail trails. Most people know about the High Line. Turns out these rail to trail conversions exist more quietly all around us. Um, I'm going to take Boston as an example. Here I have mapped out abandoned rail lines in red and multi-use trails, which is the broader class of kind of linear parks for pedestrians and cyclists in green. And where the red follows the green on the map are the rail trails. So, for those of you who are local to Boston, if you've been on the Minuteman, the Bay Colony Rail Trail, the Northern Strand Community Trail, or the one dearest to my heart, the Somerville Community Path, fun fact, they all used to be railways. Um, for those of you who are not in the Boston area, I encourage you to Google your local rail trails because I can almost guarantee that there's probably one near you. The reason for that is because in the United States, there's currently over 26,000 miles of rail trails in all 50 states. There's about 9,000 miles of rail trails under active development. And also, there is about 100,000 miles of abandoned rail in the country. So, what I hope you take away from this is that rail trails have been developed for a long time. They're currently being developed out further. And given the abundance of abandoned rail in the country, you can expect them to be developed out even further. So, in this paper, I study how rail trails shape housing markets and neighborhoods. I link new rail and trail data sets with census data in the contiguous United States. And I'm going to conduct two analyses. First, I will look at dynamic effects in Boston where I tracked decade by decade neighborhood change around trail openings. Then I'm going to conduct a long run national analysis where I evaluate whether Boston's long run impacts generalize nationwide. Um, my main findings as a preview of results is that I find that housing values rise substantially near rail trails. In Boston, I observe a 7% increase in the first decade and growing to as much as 23% over time. And nationwide, I estimate an 18% higher growth in housing prices over the long run. Um, I also observe that neighborhoods become more higher income and more educated, and that these changes are unfolding gradually over decades. So, the kind of bottom line is that rail trails are catalysts for urban revitalization, and they set in motion these self-reinforcing sorting and neighborhood change that I'll talk about in this presentation. I'll just jump into the data. Um, I combine many different data sources to do my analysis. I will just highlight them here. For abandoned rail spatial data, I use a source called Forgotten Lands, Places in Transit. This is like actually a crowdsourced data set of all the abandoned rail in the country and comparing it to kind of other sources such as the Federal Railroad Administration. I see that this actually has the most comprehensive data set. For active rail, which I use my national analysis, this comes from the Federal Railroad Administration. Specifically, I use the North American Rail Network. For my Boston study, I use data from the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. This gives me publicly available existing and planned multi-use trail data. I identify which ones are the rail trails based on which trails follow the rail, as I described in the Boston map. And I also, MassDOT provides some of the trail opening dates, and for the rest, I research opening dates by the segment. For the national analysis, unfortunately, not every state has the kind of comprehensive uh, multi-use trail data as Massachusetts. So I use a different data source. I use OpenStreetMap. I identify which basically which objects are multi-use trails as kind of publicly accessible paths designed for non-motorized use, allowing for both bicycle and pedestrian access. I filter out paths that are marked for hiking and mountain biking. The idea is that I'm not trying to, capture something like the Appalachian Trail, which would be your special hobby, but something that people can just casually walk to, and identify which trails are the rail trails using the same method above by comparing it to the abandoned rail data. And finally, for my outcomes, I use census data, specifically a 1970 to 2020 panel that's harmonized to 1970 boundaries. If you're familiar with the census, you probably know that over time, as the population in the United States increased, census tracts have become smaller and smaller. I use boundaries that are consistent in 1970 so that I observe, like within the same space, what changes are occurring over time. So let me then just dive into the dynamic effects in Boston. So I choose Boston not just because I live here, but because it has a rich history of rail trails. You can see in the map here that uh, the first kind of rail to trail conversion occurred in 1970, and they've been built out ever since to today. And furthermore, the state of Massachusetts has plans to extend various trail segments. So these are the segments in red. Um, and given all these different timings of trail openings, I exploit like the staggered timing of the trail segments for my analysis. And for my main results, I only look at what I call rail trail corridors, which are census tracts with any rail trail, and these are highlighted in pink on the map. What this leaves me with are 97 tracks with rail trails across 6 census waves from 1970 to 2020. I define a event time as the census year minus the first trail opening year. And because I only observe the census every 10 years, I bin my observations into 10-year bins, which you can see in the map here. Um, I then conduct an event study using the Sun and Abraham methodology. There's a lot of math on this slide, so I just want to highlight the intuition, which is that all I'm doing is comparing neighborhoods where trails opened earlier with neighborhoods where trails have not yet opened in the same year. The underlying assumption here is that um, neighborhoods with trails that opened earlier would have been evolving in parallel with neighborhoods with trails that opened later, absent the trail opening. Um, so let me just jump into the results. The first thing I observe are rapid and persistent increases in housing value. I first want to point out the the graph to the right of the red bar. What I observe here essentially is that within 1 decade of a rail trail opening, the median home values in these neighborhoods rise by an average of 7% compared to neighborhoods without any rail trail opening. Um, and within the second decade, home values are about 18% higher in places with rail trails, and they're about 23% higher in the third decade in places with rail trails. I next want to highlight kind of to the bars to the left of the red bar, which is the pre-period. This is saying that in both my kind of tracks with early open trails and tracks with later open trails, before any of the rail trails have opened, you see that these error bars overlap 0, which means that there's no statistical difference in development during this period, which gives me some confidence that the observations I see to the right are just due to the rail trail opening and not due to any of the other effects that might happen at the same time as a rail trail, as like green space openings. Finally, I want to point out that in 1970, the median value of a home in Boston for all my observations is about $143,000 in 2020 dollars. And if you know anything about the Boston housing market, home prices have seen tremendous growth in the past 50 years, such that even for the neighborhoods without any rail trails, I observed roughly a 30% increase in home prices per decade. So the rail trail estimates that I calculate here would be on top of that. So these are just, tremendous increases in price essentially in these neighborhoods with the rail trails. Thinking about who are the people who are moving into the neighborhoods with rail trails, what I observe is that the college educated seem to be among the first movers. This is saying that within 1 decade, the share of the college educated are about 2 percentage points higher in neighborhoods with rail trails. This is significant at the 10% level, but these numbers also shoot up in the second and third decades. Next, looking at kind of changes in area median income, I observe that there doesn't seem to be much change within the first decade of a rail trail opening, but within the second and third decades, the median household income in tracks with rail trails are about 14 and 15% higher. Interestingly, for Boston, I observed that the housing stock growth slows down. So this isn't saying that housing is getting destroyed in places with rail trails, but rather, overall we see more housing units built in the area over time. But this is saying that they're built slower in the census tracts or the neighborhoods with the rail trail. Um, then kind of looking at longer term effects, I see a slight increase in homeowner occupied housing in the third decade. So about a 2.5 percentage point higher owner occupied share in places with rail trails. And finally, for Boston, I don't see a significant evidence of demographic change, or at least I don't see significant evidence of a change in the white share of the population over this period by whether or not a tract has a rail trail opening. So taking stock of all of these things, how do I think about this in general? Well, I observe a immediate capitalization um, of rail trails into home values. This is evidenced by the 7% increase in home values within 1 decade of a rail trail opening. This then seems to be stimulating some kind of selective immigration, where first I observed that the college educated share is increasing by about 1.8 percentage points in the first decade, by about 7.7 percentage points in the second decade, and by about 9.7 percentage points in the third decade. I see, also this like rising affluence and merging potentially NIMBYism, where in the second decade, household incomes increased by about 14%, housing prices increase even more by about 19%, housing stock falls by about 5%. Um, and this seems to be generating a feedback loop where higher income residents seem to be reinforcing demand and imposing new development, such that by the third decade, the owner occupancy share has increased by about 4 percentage points. Supply, in terms of housing units, falls by 13%, and perhaps unsurprisingly, housing prices keep rising. What I take away from all this is that people seem to like rail trails, that 7% change in the first decade in housing prices without much change in the population would be evidence of that. But they love having neighbors who like rail trails, and that's potentially why you see this change in, incomes in household education, etc. So, uh, thinking about external validity, we know that Boston is not necessarily representative of the rest of the country, even in 1970. So then I conduct this second national analysis. The challenge for extending the national analysis is that trail opening dates are unavailable nationally, so I cannot replicate the Boston event study. Um, what I do here is a instrumental variables design. So I use predicted rail abandonment to predict where trails are more likely to be created. I do this to basically separate the effect of the trails from other changes happening in the same places. And then also for my outcomes, I look at kind of long difference outcomes. So essentially, I look at, let's say, differences in the change in housing value between 1970 and 2020. Uh, by comparing the long run neighborhood change over 50 years in places with trails and places with not without trails, I'm capturing the cumulative effects. And this also allows me to account for stable differences across places. So, broader macroeconomic effects on like housing markets by region of the country would be controlled for. So I'm just trying to pin down the effect of the rail trail. So I'm going to ask all of you to take a step away from housing for a second and go over this thought exercise with me. I promise that, this is important for the analysis. So what I'm trying to do here is to predict rail abandonment using a network-based approach. Um, it is a bit of history here. During the mid to late 1800s, there was a lot of competition among different railroad companies as they were trying to build out the American rail network across the country, which led to a lot of railroads everywhere, which led to a lot of redundancy in the rail network. What this means for us, as you can imagine, is that like some rail lines were more central to the greater rail network than others. So when the rail industry began to consolidate, you can imagine that the less efficiently connected lines are more likely to be abandoned. So I use a networking algorithm to basically calculate for each rail segment. This you can look at the map to the right. For each rail segment, which lines are more efficiently connected and which lines are less efficiently connected. And I basically say for lines that are less efficiently connected based on this algorithm, then these are probably the lines that are more likely to be abandoned. because if you don't need all these rail lines anymore, then the less efficiently connected ones are probably less profitable to upkeep. And what I want to highlight here is that when you compare my connectedness algorithm with actual active and abandoned rail, you see that this seems to be a good algorithm in that places that ice, due to geometry, is not as efficiently connected are also places that with actual abandoned rail. So for my analysis, I identify predicted abandoned lines as the least connected 45% of rail mileage, and this is consistent with the rail decline from in that today we see that like 45% of rail that was active historically has been abandoned now. So why did I go through this exercise? Well, what I really want to know is what is the effect of the rail trail, this is X, on my various outcomes of interest, such as, let's say, change in housing prices. I can't estimate, or it would not be a good idea to estimate kind of the impact of X on Y directly, because as I mentioned, building rail trails is correlated with a bunch of other factors. People, again, might be voting to improve their schools at the same time as they're trying to build the rail trail. So by using this predicted abandoned rail to instrument for rail trail, what I'm trying to say is, okay, this instrument is going to affect my outcome, my change in housing prices, only because it is more likely for rail trails to be built in places where the is likely to be abandoned, and the instrument is not correlated with all these other impacts. So then I have a classic two-stage least squares estimation strategy. In the first stage, I am estimating kind of whether or not a rail trail appears in the tract in the neighborhood by 2020. And I use my predicted abandoned rail to predict this. And then the second stage, I use my prediction to look at change in outcomes, such as the log median housing value. Diving into results, so in this table here, in column 1, I am trying to see if my predicted abandoned rail actually does a good job of predicting whether or not a place has abandoned rail, and you can see that in fact it does based on the high coefficient and the significance of the the significance of the coefficient. And then second, this is the first stage. What I observe is that predicted abandoned rail, it also does a good job of predicting whether or not a place has rail trails after controlling for whether or not this place has any rail, and after controlling for various 1970s baseline characteristics. So having established all of that, let me jump into the actual estimates. What I see here is that basically in census tracts or in neighborhoods with rail trails, I estimate a 18% higher increase in the log median home value. That can be attributable to the place, can be attributable to the rail trail. I estimate a 24% increase in housing supply, and I don't really see a significant effect on any changes in owner occupancy. Now, thinking about the population, I estimate a 5.3 percentage point higher share of the college educated in places with rail trails. I estimate a 14% higher increase in median household income. And finally, I estimate a relative 7.7 percentage higher share of the white population in places with rail trails versus places without. So how do we take stock of these results? What I see is that in the long run, home values rise substantially. And also the people who live nearby changes in that neighborhoods become more educated, higher income, and relatively more white. The supply response differs from Boston. As you may recall, housing stock is was declining relatively in Boston, whereas here it seems to be increasing on average nationwide. Um, the key takeaways from this is that what I estimate like seem high. An 18% increase in housing values seemed high, but actually they're pretty comparable to existing studies on one-off high-profile projects. So other studies have looked at the impact of the New York High Line on nearby residential housing prices. They estimate a 35% increase in housing values near the High Line. They've also looked at the effect on the Atlanta Beltline, and some of these studies estimate about an 18% higher housing price increase near the Beltline. And what my study shows here is that ordinary rail trails are also producing significant impacts. The one thing I'll note is that these massive increases in housing value, these are long run estimates, are likely due to the co-location of other amenities following this demographic shift that we see, rather than the direct effect of the rail trail itself. So just to conclude, trail development creates a local amenity that catalyzes further neighborhood change. In Boston, I observe these rapid price gains followed by inflows of more educated and higher income households. Nationally, broadly, I see similar patterns of rising values and compositional shifts. The one difference, the one puzzle that I'm still trying to figure out is that the housing supply response seems to be able to be both positive or negative depending on the region. So future work can explore mechanisms behind these regional differences. And for the policymaker, uh, what I take away from all of this is that rail trails can spur neighborhood revitalization. So if your goal is to revitalize a neighborhood, this is probably a powerful policy tool, but they don't necessarily guarantee long-term green access for current low-income residents. So if the goal is to, have, let's say, like poor residents, give them more access to green space, then in the long run, that might not you might just see the population shift so that a higher income set of group of people move in. So that's all I have for this study. Thank you so much. I would love to take any comments and questions now.
Michelle, thank you. It's I think a really fascinating, excuse me, and important piece of work. We've gotten some questions in online, and again, I would encourage folks, if you've got questions, please put them in. There's some questions, and I was writing some notes to myself about um, both. I'm thinking about both the starting points and the end points, but in terms of is there something different about the places that got rail trails versus those that didn't, and whether or not that might impact outcomes? And I was thinking about whether the ones that came to my mind were, you can think of rail trails that went through residential areas versus commercial. Um, how affluent were the areas that got rail trails to start with? And was there anything interesting about the racial demographics? So not looking at the change, but I don't know if in your analysis you looked at were there different starting points?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, so it's a little bit hard to figure out because so rail trails open at different times, and I don't have a great sense of when each rail trail opened. So I'm not looking at kind of like at in the same year like what the differences are. But what
Mm.
I have looked at is in 1970. I know like or rather I know what places. I know where the places with rail trails are today. So I
Mhm.
just look at kind of in 1970, what are the differences? And what I see is that kind of nationally, there is a generally places with rail trails today, back in 1970, before there were any rail trails, tended to be kind of ever so slightly more educated and more white, but the incomes actually appear to be similar with when you compare them to just the
Mm.
national average.
So slightly more educated, more because one would assume, particularly with those first generation of rail trails,
Yeah,
I mean, one would assume in general that people wanted the nearby residents, or at least some large subset of them, wanted the rail trails. Um,
right.
um, and so there's some interesting correlation there, possibly with slightly more educated. Um, and then I guess sort of related to that, I was thinking about particularly well, let's take the Boston story. So Boston in 1970, Greater Boston is a region that's not doing particularly well economically. Um, as you know, a Glazer or Barry Bluestone are fond of reminding us. Um, so how do you disentangle the rail trail story from the just general story? Although the population goes up modestly, the overall the region becomes a much more attractive place for more educated, higher income kind of knowledge workers.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is why for the Boston story, I look at just places where the trail opened earlier with places where the trail opened later. The idea is that if you can think about like, just broader macroeconomic shocks on Boston, you would like, I think it's reasonable to expect that they're hitting Boston generally. They're I don't think there's any reason for these places to be affecting uh, rail trail openings or to be correlated essentially with places with rail trails and the timing of rail trail openings. So this gives me some confidence that the effects I see are actually just the effect of the rail trail opening and not the broader kind of economic impacts on Boston.
Um, Sort of continuing a little bit in this, there's a question about um, whether you ever tried to ever disentangle whether this was the urban rail trail, a suburban rail trail, and I think in the case of a suburban, I would think also to what extent is it connecting into an urban job center? So you showed the Minuteman Bikeway, which gets you to Alewife and then into Cambridge in Boston, and the impact of a rural rail trail, where it really almost is purely recreational.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did do some heterogeneity analyses, not in this presentation. So I guess couple points. So uh, I did a part of the analysis. I basically kind of uh, just took data in the city center. I defined it as like maybe 3 miles away from within 3 miles of the city center. I looked at the effects between 3 to 10 miles of the city center. I consider that like the urban
Mhm.
ring. And then I looked at places like greater than 10 miles away from the city center. And what I observed is that actually a lot of the overall housing prices increased like in all of these three places. But interestingly, the sharpest effects seem to be coming from that urban ring of like census tracts within 3 to 10 miles of the city
Mhm.
center. And I think this is somewhat intuitive in that you can imagine within the city center, it's probably developed out. Like city centers tend to be the most dense part of the city. But within kind of like close to city, close to all these other urban amenities, that might, when you build a rail trail there, that might make it relatively more attractive for people to move there and also more flexibility for development to change. So I do observe some so that's what I took away from the analyses. I will also note that um, in 1970, because there's like not as great of a population as we see now, like the census tracts actually only cover like places like uh, near urban areas. They don't cover the entirety of the United States. So I would say that I'm generally not looking at rural effects. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Couple questions related to gentrification, because it depending on exactly how we define it, it does seem that rail trails are positively correlated. are causing some things related to gentrification. Let me actually start. Y- y- it seemed like the stories that we might think of as the most significant gentrifying. You had this wonderful line about other amenities, and I just maybe you can. What else were you thinking when you put that in? And then I'm going to follow that with a question about if you're worried about those demographic shifts. Are there some policy tools that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so I've kind of, interviewed uh, people who are actually involved in the rail trail planning process, some of whom are the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and the story they give is like, um, when, for instance, when the Cape Cod Rail Trail opened, there were a lot of like ice cream shops or other restaurants that were built along the rail trail to accommodate the people who are like biking and walking along it. Um, and those are generally like those cute stores are nice things to have, and you can imagine that there is some value associated with living on the rail trail, but also living near like a nice local restaurant. So those are some examples of the like other amenities that you might expect, like development of businesses. The other thing is that we know from the broader urban literature is that like as a population of people become more educated, you can expect kind of different types of stores or different types of businesses to be moving in to serve that population versus the previous population. You could expect kind of, the the value of living near, I don't know, like a local bank might be different from the value near of living near like a like like a easy cash, like a yeah, like a place where you can get a loan for quick but also expensive. So those are the types of things. And then can you remind me of the second
So
question you asked?
the second question was to say, and then there's going to be a third question, but I'll just ask the
Okay.
third question later, which was if you're thinking about a rail trail, particularly in a neighborhood that's going to go through an area that's lower income, and possibly more racially diverse, um, and you look at these results and you say, well, the net effect, as you said, if your goal is to provide access for folks of more modest means, right, this might not actually get you there in the long run. Have you thought about or have you run across interesting examples of ancillary policies that would help ensure at least some of the people who live there now, uh,
Yeah.
either they or people like them, will be living there later?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a great question and one I'm trying to puzzle out. I mean, my understanding is that we have a great housing supply shortage in general in like almost every part of the country. Um, i- and when there's not a lot of housing, housing is going to be very expensive. Housing near nice things like rail trails probably would be more expensive. So a in general, like the traditional economics tells us that well, if you increase the supply, prices are going to come down. So one thought is maybe what if we just uh, you know, build more housing along rail trails, and then you can expect there might be some equilibrium changes such that you get a relatively a lower cost of the rail trail amenity if you have a lot of housing there. So that's my first thought. The other thing is that yeah, I mean, the story of gentrification is difficult, but a thought is that like there's going to be winners and losers when like all I'm saying is that rail trails have value. So when you create this new valuable amenity here, then actually some people like homeowners are going to get a great windfall of profit, right? Because their home value just increased significantly. And not all of these homeowners, especially when you're thinking about residential homeowners, are necessarily like are going to be immediately like rich or like more white. So there's potentially like it's something that you need to untangle more carefully, but there's potentially a group of people who are actually benefiting significantly in that they see their home values increase and they can either you know experience this nice amenity if they care for it, or they can sell their house and then, you know, move somewhere more and use that money to buy other things that they care
Yeah.
about.
No, it's interesting. The sort of corollary here is given the rise in home values, there have been a couple of questions about financing, including what happens, US DOT in the current administration seems much less enamored of
Yeah.
rail trails. Um, One could imagine saying if you're going to put this rail trail in and land values are going to go up, um, conceptually and perhaps in practice, you might want to think about some sort of land value recapture mechanism. And I don't know if you've run across so many interesting examples of that. And to my mind, it sort of connected back saying, well, gosh, if you did that, maybe you could also take some of that money into an affordable housing fund.
Yeah, I unfortunately I am less familiar with the land value recapture
Yep.
mechanism, but I think what this study gives is that like there's great potential for creative solutions such as that to build more green space and also more housing. Yeah.
I want to flip. There have been a couple questions that have come in um, about impacts. So broadly, the things that I know we could see are things like, do you see any change, for places served by rail trails, do you see any changes in commuting patterns? More people walking or commuting, well, or ch any interesting differences in things like the number of vehicles that people near rail trails own. Um, or other any other kind of effects that tell us anything about the use of rail trails that you can tease from the data.
Yeah, I have not looked at it in my analysis. I think that's actually a great thing to look at. Like directly in the census, there are values for like time to commute or mode of commute. So those are would be important things to look at. I did not get a chance to incorporate that in the paper right now. But I mean. I think that would be really interesting. The other thing is like, especially, so Massachusetts is certainly doing this, and I believe kind of many kind of planning agencies in other parts of the country are as well. When they're thinking about which new projects to fund, they're absolutely thinking about connectivity, about kind of, can this can this segment do a great job of connecting a community to, a longer rail trail or even to public transit so that they can, uh, like they can have a better, a more effective way of active transit as opposed to used by car. So what that kind of theoretically would imply is that yes, they should have an effect. And furthermore, when you build out new rail trails, you can actually increase the value of existing rail trails by making them connected to more places. So I would expect it to be positive.
It's interesting because you spur the thought, and this is one of those things where you probably thought of this, of if you did the same kind of network analysis that you did on rail lines to rail trails and
Mhm.
said, to what extent is this, is this just a rail trail that's 5 miles in the middle of nowhere that doesn't actually connect to anything versus is this a rail trail that is part, somehow connects you to a larger network? Um, Intuitively, I would think that the latter would produce more dramatic impacts on land values, but I don't know if that's a question you looked at or thought about.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's so I use that network analysis for a very specific task
Yeah.
for statistical reasons, but absolutely. I mean, there is I've seen other papers do an analysis called something called like a minimum spanning tree, where the idea is basically you have a bunch of places that you're trying to target for connectedness, and then the algorithm basically calculates you need to connect all these places together. What is the shortest way to do this? And you might be interested in this because the shortest way to do this is also the most cost-effective way. So yeah, I think that would be yeah, I don't know if kind of how planning agencies are thinking about this. I'm sure there's like political feasibility reasons for this as well, but I think it'd be really, really cool to if you're a planner and thinking about, I would like to connect these particular communities, then,
Yeah.
how do I take advantage of the rail network and figure that out? Yeah.
Yeah. There are a bunch of folks have left as part of their questions saying, I'm a planner with this, and here's one of the things we're thinking about, or
Oh,
I think
see
you'll
those
find
comments. Yeah.
some rich stuff. Another question that came up is, um, do you have any sense as to, so you've looked particularly at rail trails, the framing of the paper, and at the beginning of the talk was also just the value of kind of green amenities. And I'm wondering if you've had a chance to kind of say, how do rail trails compare with like, other kinds of investments in green infrastructure, larger park systems, I guess, playground, where do these sort of fit in that toolkit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I it's a little bit difficult to answer like with certainty because as I mentioned, like parks come up with, let's say, schools and how do you
Yeah.
disentangle the effect of the good school from the park. Part of my analysis that is in the papers, I try to compare the value of a rail trail with other types of discrete environmental amenities. So I looked at, for instance, studies on the cleanup of Superfund sites or studies on the opening of a new transit. And what I observe is that if I feel the most confident taking the 7% change in housing prices as the value of the rail trail, because that happens within the first decade. You don't see much change in like the demographics of the population. And that's actually closest to in relative to other studies closest to the value of a brownfield cleanup. So these are these are places that are like not quite as toxic as a Superfund site, but slightly contaminated. There's a program to basically give those places funding, clean up the toxins, and then generally they get rebuilt either into like a new development or like maybe like a new park. And what my estimate is kind of within the middle of the range of estimates for brownfield cleanup. So I would say it's probably comparable to other parks or new buildings that are that might also have like a nice public green space associated with it.
I'm curious, again, there's a couple of questions about as I've told you, our audience is a little bit less is often a more practitioner oriented audience and less of an academic who's going to worry about the statistical significance. I know who your mentors are, and I trust your findings. Um, but I'm wondering, for both the practitioners and advocates in here who are, I think, both thinking about what is if they're trying to convince folks that a rail trail is a good idea, particularly if it's going to require some fun, some funding, and also what are the things they ought to be concerned about, or what are um, the kind of counter arguments. What's your advice to folks about what's sort of the best story they can tell, and what do they need to be prepared to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best story in my mind is that they people like rail trails are valuable because people like them, and that's a good thing. I think if you so okay, so I know anecdotally, even in Massachusetts, like not every place has historically uh accepted the rail trail. So even recently, I believe there's a story where uh in Dedham, Massachusetts, there was the potential to kind of build a rail trail that connected it to like a broader network. And in 20, I want to say 2020, there was a referendum that basically in the town of Dedham that said if the rail trail were free because the state would pay for parts of it, would you accept a rail trail? And the town voted against it. And I think that's where I think like there for advocacy groups or for planners, I think there is a good opportunity to say, look, like you know, this is valuable. It's good for other people, and that it's connecting places to each other, and also it's good for you if you're a homeowner because it's going to increase your home values. Um, so yeah, and then I think for the town, if there's any opposition, I mean, changes in home values are going to coincide with kind of an increase in your tax base, which means that there's more funding to for other social services that you might want to implement, and I think all of those are good things.
Hmm.
The thing to be concerned about, from my perspective, is that yeah, I mean, the tricky thing is, in general, I don't think this is a rail trail effect so much as a gentrification effect. When things get nicer, like they are like more expensive places, means that some people, especially renters, are going to be priced out. Um, I think what I take from my analyses is that the simple story of, we're going to introduce a new rail trail to, like, let's say this neighborhood that tends to be like more poor or more minority based, and that's going to like benefit the population. That's where it's a little bit more nuanced. It might if most of them own their homes and then they'll see a increase in their home values, or it might not if they're renters, and then you get a bunch of like yuppies who decide that this is a really nice place to live. Um, I mean, yeah, they're the policymaker could. I'm sure have other tools in their toolbox thinking about how to protect existing people who live there. But that story I think is like deserves also more nuance and thoughtfulness. Yeah.
Just I meant to ask this a little bit
Okay.
earlier because it's a very specific point, but that home price impact, how far out do you think that that goes? Is it the house next to the rail trail, quarter mile, a mile, 5 miles? Um,
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. So I'm looking at so what my unit of observation is whether or not a census tract
mhm.
has a rail trail. So generally, let's see, 1970 census tracts, they're not big. They're very population dependent also.
Right, right.
Um, so
So the
my
implication is it's a fairly close in effect. That
Yeah, it's a fairly close in effect. And then one question I sometimes get is like, what about a census tract that's like next to the census tract with the rail trail, but actually like census tracts are divided oftentimes by like
right.
large streets or by like rivers. So
Yep,
it's not actually that easy to get
yep,
from one tract to the other. So yeah.
yep,
Yeah, so not like next to the rail trail, but certainly like
yep,
within walking
yep.
distance. Yeah.
Yep. Well, as you'll see, and again, apologies to the folks whose questions I didn't get a chance to ask, and hopefully the ones I did get to ask, I was able to paraphrase your question correctly, but if I didn't, apologies. But we will be sharing all of these with Michelle, and again, I think you'll actually find it um, this voice of folks who are deeply involved. Um, the great thing about the fun thing about the Meyer Fellowship, for folks who don't know it, is, um, about a year or two ago, so we provide a couple fellowships a year that help basically doctoral students finish their dissertation, which thankfully Michelle has. Um, and they come in with these really interesting ideas, and we look at it and we kind of assess, could they actually do this? And is it, and then, about a year or so later, I get to call people up and say, where are you? Are you about ready to present? And Michelle shared with me this work, and we were excited, the selection committee, when we saw it, because I think it's a really interesting question, not one that we'd been able to delve into. And I appreciate both the carefulness in your analysis, the creativity of how, particularly with the national, and the clarity with which you were able to explain it, to an audience that I assume for the most part is not PhD level economists, but folks who could really benefit from this. So this is really exactly what we wanted the fellowship to do. We get to encourage a young scholar, and then young scholar produces results that folks are really interested in and trying to figure out how to use. So I want to thank you. If you are a doctoral student at Harvard at the thesis writing stage and doing something on housing, the application deadline for the Meyer Fellowship's coming up. And if you're not one of those people, keep an eye on the Joint Center because we'll be over the coming years, presenting work from subsequent Meyer Fellows. So on behalf of the folks who've been here, Michelle, thank you for a terrific presentation. And I hope everybody has a great day, and wherever it is that you are, it's becoming spring. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you so much.